All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm okay. How are you? Thanks for hosting me.
I'm doing well. I'm glad to have you back. So,
Likewise.
specifically, I brought you on the show for a reason, and that's because I wanted to talk with you about South Africa. I again, like I've said before, you have a wealth of knowledge, but I always like to talk to you about the things I haven't heard you talk to other people about, or at least not in depth. So, if you could kind of explain why South Africa is a topic worthy of conversation.
There's a few reasons. I mean, obviously, it it featured kind of front and center in terms of people's civic consciousness in the 1980s for a few reasons. South Africa became a lightning rod uh, of for mobilization by hostile elements. People on the left. I mean, all and sundry. Um, because it was viewed as kind of the distilled essence of of an evil government, owing to the fact that its internal situation was singularly characterized by race, quite literally. And it was a rare example of a post Nuremberg regime, other than Israel, but Israel's a complicated case for reasons that are kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about here. But other than Israel, South Africa was really the only kind of openly racialized society. As a matter of law, I mean, okay, South Africa literally had a legal regime that defined um, what we consider to be equal protection and due process rights, um, according to racial criteria. And there was this whole Byzantine bureaucracy of that dealt with race and how race was categorized. And how it was done so was a combination of biological criteria and physical morphology, as well as social criteria that were that relied upon the testimony of people who knew the person in question, which sounds really really strange. Okay, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But just what I'm talking about is quite literally in South Africa, there's like mixed race people whose racial status, as in terms of de jure categories, like could be changed. Like, it could be changed as a matter of law from a black person to a white person. If you quote acted white. If you were accepted in a white community, like things like this. Okay, this was very strange, and I'm not putting shade on the Boer regime because I in the epoch they were they were trying to they were trying to craft a system that was workable and that at least approach objectivity, but it's a very strange way to approach race. Okay, by contemporary metrics. I don't mean like woke metrics. I mean that like you can't just reduce race to things like morphology and stuff. Okay, like it's far more deep than that. It's far more nuanced. There's a metaphysical aspect. I don't mean in a I don't mean that in like an airy kind of mystical way, but it's not something that lends itself to that kind of inflexible categorization de jure, because there's limitations to the law. The law is not this it's not this tool that has this kind of wide penumbra that can just kind of identify and solve social problems. Okay, it's just not. And South Africa is kind of a prime example of that. South Africa also, I mean, obviously, the as Marxist as Marxist Leninism, a traditional sort in Europe, like lost momentum. The third world, the quote colored world, as it was called in less delicate times, became more important. I mean, not just because that was the primary battleground between NATO and the Warsaw Pact politically, who would come to dominate the third world, because the one of the things that ended the Cold War was that it came to be clear that the third world was going to model itself after the West. Okay, but it took until the end of the 20th century for that process to fully develop. The world lay in literal ruins after the Second World War, but also politically, it wasn't clear like what kind of form. There's about a third of the planet had been under direct European dominion. Okay, and even that which wasn't was still emulating those states that were. So a huge aspect of the Cold War, once kind of nuclear parity set in, especially, was okay. Like, you know, which way is the third world going to go? So decolonization and the quote anti-imperialist movement this became this kind of, aside from the geostrategic imperatives therein, it kind of insinuated new life into revolutionary communism. But South Africa was a unique state because South Africa had been a colonial state of the UK, but before that, it was settled by free Protestants, like quite literally. There's a reason why the Orange Free State was the Orange Free State. You know, it was the Boers are and were a population where Netherlands culture, Dutch culture is the dominant like linguistic and cultural modality. But there's English, there's Scots, there's Huguenots. There's all kinds of dissenter Protestants who found their way to South Africa because they wouldn't be persecuted. And it was a place that until the end of the 19th century, no European power had claim over it. So if you were a Calvinist, dissenter Protestant, and you wanted to find a place where you could live among white people who shared your faith, and you wanted to make sure you weren't going to be availed to, a French king or who would just as soon, massacre you for being heretics, or a British monarch that would, kind of try and turn the territory you settle into a commercial colony. That's what's unique about South Africa too. And there was two terrible wars fought between the Boers and the British Crown. When the British Crown developed designs on it, owing to various things like mining rights and access to territory on the Cape. Obviously, it always has geostrategic significance. But point being, ultimately, when the South Africa was not like Angola, it was not even like Rhodesia. It was its own thing. You had a population of white people whose one of the reasons I think their cause is important to people like us is because they are white Calvinists and who hail from diverse backgrounds in Northern Europe, and they arrived in Africa for a lot of the same reasons our ancestors arrived here, and their experience was very different than that of the Portuguese Angolans or the Anglo-Saxon people in Rhodesia. And those people found common cause later on, and Ian Smith talked about that in his autobiography. For those that don't know, Ian Smith was the last prime minister of Rhodesia, and he was he was not a particularly exciting guy. He wasn't some firebrand orator, but he was a great leader in his own right, in my opinion. Okay, but he was kind of a typically pragmatic, like Anglo type. But I don't want to digress too much. But that's why South Africa is complicated. And also, what we'll get into as we deep dive too, South Africa was mischaracterized, and it continues to be kind of today, because people talked about it in America and to a lesser degree in Europe like it was the American South or something. Like there was this quote, these black people and these white people. Like Clive Derby Lewis, and we'll get a little bit into him too, who in my opinion is a real hero. I think Eugene Terreblanche was a real clown, okay, and a very negative person. And it's unfortunate that people identify white resistance with him and not men like Lewis. But like Lewis said, there's not quote black South Africa. There's dozens of tribes in South Africa who don't particularly get along, who speak different languages, who even have different morphological characteristics to the point you could say they're not even the same, race. This idea that like Nelson Mandela was the leader of the black people, and there was these millions of black people who were, being oppressed. That's not the case.
Well,
go ahead.
It's interesting you bring that up, because there are a few guys in our circles from South Africa, right? There's Marhobane, there's Conscious Caracal, and they're good guys, right? They're involved with AfriForum and a couple other, like Boer advocacy groups. But it's interesting because they bring that up. Actually, Mr. Patriarch, another guy on this side of things, he's been quiet for a while, but he's also lives in South Africa. And they bring that up. They're like, look, like the idea that Americans come in and kind of view this through the lens of 1958 Mississippi, stupid. It's like, look, like the primary violence in the last like big round of semi-regular race riots that sweeps through South Africa, it was primarily like essentially a couple different tribes. I think it was the Zulus and one of the others against Indians, brought in under the crown, and against coloreds. And coloreds is not a slur in this context. It's a very specific group of essentially like, and I don't remember correctly, it's like mixed white, black, and then also I
Malaysian
think
and they're
Malaysian.
Malay,
Yes, yeah.
Cape colored or Malay, in large part. But yeah, and it's periodically the Zulus and the Boers have found themselves not just allied in government, but basically pursuing common objectives. And one of the reasons why Mandela sought out a political course is he was as much trying to rook tribes hostile to his own traditionally as he was the white power structure. Okay, and the way to look at it's like Derby Lewis said, like he's speaking of himself and his own people. He's like, we're the white tribe here, and that's not just hyperbole. That's very true. And
Well, and
you
it's
know,
interesting too because even and that was actually one of the things that I noticed in so we're both referencing or at least I'm referencing an interview Thomas sent me, which I'll include in the show notes to this, where essentially Clive Davis Lewis gave a talk for I'm trying to summarize him while being YouTube friendly. Essentially, he was a political, he committed or was involved in a political assassination that we can get into later, but it's interesting because he said, in his perspective, you were a South African essentially if South Africa was your first priority. He was a nationalist in that sense. And that's interesting because that's kind of contrary to a lot of the, at least from what I read as like internecine fighting between essentially like Anglo South Africans. So, and then the Boers, they're different stock, they're different people, different language, different school system. And obviously you can see how that would create, certain levels of, discord between the two communities.
there was efforts, and Lewis is an interesting guy, among other things, because his background was Anglo. Like he was Catholic. He converted to Protestantism. But his background was Anglo, and he identified very much with the Boer cause. And the National Party, particularly as the internal situation became more critical, they very much tried to generate a kind of bigger tense sensibility among whites, Anglo descended whites as well as the Boers, and to some degree that was successful, but never as much as they wanted to be. But there were key individuals like Lewis who was Anglo by background, who identified 100% with the Boer cause. Like on David Irving's website in 1987 or so, when he visited South Africa, like he was palling around with Clive Derby Lewis, and it's really interesting because he, like in that moment, that was just a few years before the real kind of crisis set in. But they, obviously they're both guys I have a lot of esteem for, and I had no idea until really recently they were even acquainted. But yeah, it's a complex issue how different white populations related, but and the Rhodesians and the Angolans became very tight. The Portuguese Angolans became very tight allies. As part of that ode to the Bush War, where for those that don't know, the 50,000 Cuban army troops ended up on the ground in Angola, and post Vietnam, that was a major Cold War battle theater, for reasons that should be fairly obvious. But the South African whites, the Boers, they were never quite able to capture that same sort of amicability as existed between the Rhodesians and the Portuguese. But some guys who lived there, within our faction could describe that better than I could. But it's important. Yeah, I mean, the main point I was trying to drive home about ethnos versus biological race is, just what you said in reference to Derby Lewis's interview, and that, being the fact that there's not, South Africa's not like America. There's not a basically homogenous black population, and black folk in America are actually quite homogenous. Their ancestry generally it can be traced to a handful of places. It's not they're not this like super diverse population. Okay. South Africa, however, I mean, again, there's literally dozens of tribes that have discrete cultural practices, speak different languages, do not see eye to eye on basic matters of political concern and things. So it's, I mean, you can argue against apartheid for various reasons, but yeah, this trying to try to pretend as if it's like the American situation is off base. However, again, like I did say a minute ago, though, the Boers are more like us than most people on this planet. Okay, I mean, they they're even more like us, I would argue, than Ulster Protestants who are also like us. I find it kind of weird, particularly, and I'm not trashing like white nationalists, but when I talk to white nationalists who, they identify with like Russia or something, or like orthodoxy, and it's like, look, man, like if you're a dissenter and you're white and you speak English because your forebears did, like your people kind of in terms of diaspora are in places like Ulster and in places like South Africa. They're not Romanian and Russian guys, like who get into like Orthodox esoterica. There's nothing wrong with that if that's your culture, but it is weird for Anglo dissenters to identify with that kind of thing. I mean, I guess people do because they think it's like exotic and cool or something. But so I always considered South Africa to be important, and again during the Cold War, particularly the final phase, it became a critical ally. And that's why one of the reasons I don't want to get into a big Reagan debate because I always find myself. I mean, people really like Reagan to this day, and I don't particularly. However, I do stand by my statements that his national security cabinet was second to none in terms of the talent therein. And within the bounded rationality of the Cold War, they had a remarkable grand strategy. Okay, and that's Reagan refused to. I mean, Congress, sanctioned South Africa in all kinds of ways, but Reagan refused to allow that to bleed into the executive branch, and he and his cabinet, particularly during his first term, viewed South Africa as an essential hedge, which it was, and they were in active combat against Warsaw Pact and Cuban elements. Okay, so obviously, if Africa had gone communist, that would have tipped the balance in basic ways geostrategically. And I've made the point before, and again, I don't want to go too far on such a tangent, but in military terms, America during the détente era was losing the Cold War. Okay, politically it was not, but the political and the military aspect of power political affairs converge, but they're not synonymous. Okay, and America would have had a very serious problem on its hands if Marxist Leninism had swept Africa, had swept Latin America, south of Mexico, and this would have America would have found itself basically a garrison state. Okay, amidst an essentially hostile world. And that's the way to understand the Reagan administration, especially the first term. That's the way to understand why there was a lot of support for South Africa, even in basically neoconservative circles. Okay, it was just kind of across the board understood that this was necessary. So that's why South Africa has like loomed large in the public consciousness. There's even like a stupid like one of those like Lethal Weapon movies that came out in 88 or 89, like the bad guys in it are literally these South Africans who like run around like doing all these evil things. I mean, which is ridiculous. I mean, Hollywood's always been propaganda oriented, but it was very on the nose, and that kind of garbage was ubiquitous. But the reason why like mainstream Republicans supported the Boer Republic, it was not because for the reasons why like people like you and I like find common cause with Afrikaners. Okay, it was very much it was inextricably related to grand strategy in the final phase of the Cold War. But and plus too, I will say Afrikaners are remarkable people, and for a population as small as they are, they've had a huge impact. And I mean, they continue to today. Like whether you love or hate Elon Musk, he's an incredibly accomplished guy, and they're just remarkable people, and they like our ancestors did. They carved civilization out of a hostile wilderness, a truly hostile wilderness, You know, I mean, even in some ways, even more so than America. You know, so yeah, you know, the aside from the political intrigues and things, and aside from the world situation, making South Africa more important than a small country like that might be. You know, like you know, the Afrikaner people are have made had an outsized impact, and again, they continue to. You know, so they really are a remarkable population. So
That that's well said. So to me, if we're talking about, South Africa and kind of their importance over the 20th century, the first thing that kind of, I guess, springs to my mind is kind of like leading up to the start of, the 20th century, and kind of the machinations that played uh, between Germany and the UK as it relates to South Africa. So can you explain how that kind of diplomatic situation, like what happened there and why that matters?
well, the strangely, and this actually is important. It's not just some stupid thing that some court historian came up with. The collision course of the Kaiserreich and the United Kingdom, a lot of that owed to basic enmity between the Kaiser and between King George that became more and more intense. You know, they were these guys, King George and the Kaiser, like they looked almost identical. You know, they were related. You know, but they were cousins, but they looked like they could be brothers. Okay, and so there's kind of like this Manichean weirdness to the fact that they came to hate one another. That's not. I mean, obviously there was complex reasons why the relationship between London and Berlin like went so south. Not most of which are not particularly rational. Okay, but um, uh, Wilhelm felt constantly slighted by London, and Wilhelm was actually a pretty ugly character. There's a reason why Adolf Hitler denied him a state funeral when he died. Okay, um, he just was not. He was not a good man, um, in any sense of the term. Okay, but neither was King George. But there was this kind of in those days, particularly because the Kaiser was the head of state, as well as the chancellor was the head of government, but he was accountable to the Kaiser. And the UK to this day, like the royals hold sway in a way that's weird in the modern era. You know, so the kind of preferences and animosities of the Kaiser and the king respectively had like loomed large over politics in a way that can't be said for other states. And when in the course of the Second Boer War, Paul Kruger, who was this kind of dashing Boer partisan, um, he he pulled off a major operation against British forces, and Wilhelm Wilhelm sent him a telegram congratulating him. You know, essentially on defeating the British Empire. You know, in his own small way. And some people like Christopher Clark, he's a guy who he writes primarily about the history of Germany, but he's written pretty extensively on the Great War, and he cites that as being kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of you know uh, relations between Berlin and London um, deteriorating into conditions of genuine animosity, um, wherein war became somewhat inevitable when a adequate catalyst emerged. So there's that. And despite what people don't think of Germany as an imperial power in the 19th century sense, but it was to some degree. And in what's now Namibia, that was German Africa. Okay. And so I mean, Germany did have a toehold in sub-Saharan Africa, and like Hermann Goering's family actually made part of their fortune in Africa. All right, but so there was Germany had Germany's uh, cultural sphere of influence touched and concerned white people in Africa too. Okay, it was not just the French and the Anglo Saxons and the Portuguese. So the Afrikaners came to identify very strongly with Germany. I mean, not just because they're culturally Dutch in large part, but they had German Protestants and Dutch Calvinists are different, but they are both dissenters. Okay, and there was a basic there's a basic affinity between Protestant Germany and the Afrikaners. So I mean that there's that too. When the uh, the German view of the British as kind of this bully power that insisted on that it had a mandate to dominate the planet as in key theaters. Yet it was unwilling to allow it was unwilling to allow any other power, any other European power to pursue the same course. And not only they didn't even and adding insult to injury, like the British were obsessed with this kind of obnoxious moral cant. They didn't just characterize this in terms of a realistic policy course wherein they had to look out for their own best interests and that of their people. So as opposed to the Germans always had a political identity as well as uh cultural ethics and what they viewed as the role of loyalty therein. I mean, always had an ethno-racial characteristic that was prominent, which is correct. And the British too. I'm not talking about English people. I'm talking about their regime. Always disdain that. In kind of stupid and condescending ways. And just this there was something of a Weltanschauungskrieg did come to exist somewhat between the UK and Germany. I mean, different from obviously, that of between Christians and Jews, or between German National Socialists and Russian Bolsheviks. But nevertheless, there was an aspect of open political warfare that came to characterize Anglo-German relations. And I will add, and I mean, people can tell me this is a conceptual bias, that basically was the UK's fault. Okay, because I don't think that can be denied. Pretty much at every turn in the modern era, the Germans tried to cultivate the British, and the British always sued for war. I mean, if you sue for war 100% of the time, I mean that you're not a reasonable actor. Okay, I mean that's got a parallel today in um the way America behaves in places like Ukraine. If your end game is to find a way to go to war, um people can't reason with you. Okay, and you're not acting in good faith. So there's that. But that that's kind of the relationship between what became the Boer Republic, and prior to that, the kind of the Afrikaner population and the German Empire and later the German Reich. And um, as you'll notice, even though I've got nothing to say about Terra Blanche, the AWB, I've got a lot of respect for, and and those people, they still they openly fly the swastika and stuff. They've got no qualms about that or anything. So and that's good. That's what they should do. But so that yeah, they such that the boards identify with anybody. They identify with Germany very strongly.
All right. So if we're talking about kind of my interaction with South Africa, it's kind of this, and you kind of hinted at it. It seemed like for a lot of people who kind of came of age during the 80s, so, kind of my parents' generation, South Africa was kind of one of the like laundry list of kind of just like social ills that all good people felt a certain way on.
Oh
So
yeah.
it was like, well, nuclear disarmament, peace in Ireland, you know, and South Africa. It's kind of like rattled off in a list like that. So can you maybe like go into that a little bit, just like your experience growing up during the time was very much kind of one of the like, I guess, like unadulterated goods in heavy scare quotes of kind of like polite society.
Well, yeah, and like I said, it the Cold War became very fixated on narratives. Okay, so it's a combination of and back in those days, I always make the point again and again how bizarre it is that the military. I'm not talking about grunts and enlisted people. I'm talking about the brass. I can't emphasize how bizarre it is in the 20 that as of today, like the military is like woke incorporated like homicide division. Like it because the Pentagon and the precursors to the woke were totally at odds in the past, like intractably so, and that endured until the Clinton administration. Okay, and there was something of a very real Kulturkampf against the Pentagon by the Clinton regime, which is why people like these clowns and these lunatics like Wesley Clark, the kind of the first woke general emerged. But there's a few different layers to it in the 80s. Like I said, the the social justice types, they're always looking for some kind of like bumper sticker cause. Um, the truly the kind of radical post 68 communists in America, who would become very anti-Stalinist, but claimed that that's why they all identified with Mao, and they identified strongly with North Vietnam when the war was raging. Their whole thing, was they were Trotsky and Foucault were kind of their patron saints. So they were constantly making the claim that like South Africa is the distilled essence of capitalism, and capitalism is intrinsically patriarchal and racist. But also the traditional Marxist Leninists, you know, who'd fallen very much out of favor. I'm talking about like the CP Communist Party USA guys, under like Gus Hall. They South Africa was in their gun sights too, because their troops, whether you're talking about DDR and Soviet advisors on the ground or the actual Cuban army, they were in active combat with the South African Defense Forces, and yeah, that was they they emphasize it for different reasons, but of course they were saying like this is South Africa's racialized because that's the best way of oppressing the proletariat there, like white and black, but that, and yeah, it's important that it's insightful that you raise the issue of Northern Ireland too, because yeah, that was part of the package. Like you were a bad person if you didn't support the Fenians in Northern Ireland. You were a bad person if you sympathized with white South Africa. It was a kind of like virtue signaling writ large by people who weren't particularly thoughtful. And yeah, it on top of that, there was the like I said, the Cold War dynamic, and diverse factions of the left. It had something for all of them in order to kind of argue their case. And in the 80s, that was getting increasingly difficult for them. Okay, however, like the 80s was when the 80s and 90s were nothing like today. But I mean, the social engineering regime was well underway, and the idea that quote racism is the worst thing is this grave moral defect, that owes to moral deformity in the Western mind and character. This loomed very large, and this was constantly bandied about. Okay, so if you could find, if you could point to a real world example of apartheid quote racism, that became your kind of exhibit A to like indict the West. Okay, and obviously that doesn't mean like a thinking person would be like that. That's ridiculous. That's trash. But we're not talking about thinking people. We're talking about we're talking about basically middle class people who are chasing clout, so they just take on ideas because they want to feel good about themselves, and they think that that's what sophisticated people do. It it really is that simple. But in the case, like I said, in the case of guys who the minority of the American left, guys like Hobsbawm was, and guys like Sartre was, frankly, when he was alive, who were still pro-Soviet, and I mean they were very much a minority on the left, but they were a vocal minority. Like I said, they held out South Africa as an like, see, this is the future of America. Like you'll have an increasingly colored America on this like white oppressor class that racializes everybody's conceptual horizon, in order to oppress the proletariat and prevent the advent of socialism. And then you just had like a typical like new left crazies, who are kind of the dominant voice in academic Marxism. But then you also had just like you had just kind of like the like the Midwest Slavs who just like bandwagoned. So I mean that's why it. I mean, I had kind of a weird experience growing up because like I grew up in what I hate this term, and I'm not because it sounds like I'm clout chasing or something. Absolutely not. I'm just being honest. I grew up in what people would call a super zip. Okay. But it was a bunch. It was a bunch of. It was a bunch of Jewish people, like rich Catholic people, and like 10 or 15% like rich, like Asian and like Hindu immigrants. So it's like I didn't. Me and my family like didn't fit in with these people. Okay, we went to the Presby church like the next town over. My dad was an Okie guy who ended up going to Harvard and made it, you know, very much in life. But you know, he was a cold warrior. Like literally, that was his job. You know, my mom was like a doctor's daughter from LA, you know, like, and she'd been a rich kid. So my folks were people who, whatever their faults, they were many. My folks were not, you know, proto woke, and like my folks basically looked at their neighbors and would tell me like these people are idiots, you know. So like I was in kind of a different environment. It's not like my folks were like hard right people, because by today's standards they might be viewed that way, but for the time they weren't, you know. But they were just kind of like regular like Presby Republicans. But they basically insinuated to me, like, look, you're gonna hear fucked up things in school. Like our neighbors are like goofy immigrants and people who, you know, have agendas. So just like be aware of that. You know, I mean, they said that without saying it. If you follow me, so I mean,
Right.
I was kind of like a critical eye about this. So that's why I don't totally relate when people are like, oh, but you know, growing up, you have no choice. You have to think this way. And I'm like, what do you mean? Then I realized, like most people in kind of like random America, they're they live around people like them, at least in basic terms. Like I did not. Okay, so maybe that's why it was like easier for me to get over those things. It's not because I'm smarter than anybody or have like better insight or something, but yeah. Point being, even before I was mature enough, you know, as like a later teenager to think, you know, in more developed conceptual terms. Even as like a kid, when I was like 12 years old, I realized like what's being said about South Africa doesn't really make any sense. You know what I mean? Like so, but yeah, it was ubiquitous.
So again, speaking in the language of kind of the like the the like, and I'm sure I don't know what the correct term is this, but the kind of like the fuzzy, like never explicitly stated, like kind of version of events. What kind of happened with, again, heavy scare quotes is essentially like, all right, uh, apartheid was ended. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee set out to make everything fair and correct and deal with everyone, honestly. And then South Africa magically became, essentially a European democracy. And it's odd to me because obviously that's fundamentally untrue. But what's interesting is, to me at least, one of the first areas it became very apparent that whatever, if you want to say the Nuremberg regime, the managerial regime, that they were kind of failing. And not in the sense that like, oh, they're losing their power immediately, but just that like the things that they want to do, they do not have the power to do. To me, seems to be South Africa. Like it kind of seemed relatively quickly that things were not going well. And now we've got to the point where it's very, very apparently not going well. And
Well,
so it's kind of like the promises of 90s liberalism. It's like, oh, we beat the Ruskies, we achieved reconciliation in South Africa, and now we've done it. We did everything. And very quickly both of those promises kind of started to ring hollow. Do you see what I'm saying?
yeah. Well, I've got to insinuate something, and most people don't know about this in America. What really people are like, how did South Africa fall without a shot being fired? Shots were fired, and there was this horrible footage, and it aired on CNN at the time. One of the Bantu Stands, for people that don't know, from about the Botha regime onward in the 70s, the idea was that South Africa was what they were going to do is they were going to transfer populations to tribal areas called Bantu Stands, where within these territories they would be basically homogenous. Okay, so this was a way of like affording sovereignty, and management of their own affairs to the indigenous element. Okay, and there's a number of these quote unquote Bantu Stands, one of which was Bofu Setswana. Okay, and Bofu Setswana had a president that now these Bantu Stands were recognized as sovereign states by South Africa, but the rest of the world claimed that they were illegitimate. Okay, and that they were just contrivances of Pretoria. That was not entirely true, and both with that Botswana specifically, the regime there did not want to join the Union of South Africa. They wanted to remain sovereign. There was an element on the ground that was highly radicalized and Marxist-Leninist sympathies. Something of a civil unrest developed between the government there and this element on the ground. And the AWB under Terre Blanche, they invaded quite literally to support the both with that Botswana regime, and they acted like real cowboys. And they started throwing shots at a bunch of these protesters and stuff. They ended up trading fire with the police there, and this car was pulled over where these AWB Afrikaner dudes who'd been wounded, and they put their hands up to surrender, and a black cop went over one by one. He shot each of them in the head and just killed them. Like, he executed them on the spot. So Terre Blanche then said basically, like, this is a race war. Like, we're at war. And kudos to the South African Defense Forces, because a guy in their general staff, he was the founder of what was called the Afrikaner Volksfront. You know, so I mean, he was very much like for his people. He wasn't some liberal, but he basically was able to diffuse the situation and prevent like open slaughter between whites and blacks from, you know, jumping off from both with Botswana like across, you know, the entire republic. But you know, South Africa was very much like on the cusp of a bloody race war. Okay, I mean, it wasn't like it wasn't a case where like a bunch of dopey fucking idiots like you know, like in the EU today, like they just say, you know, we're like just like, oh, let's have a rainbow nation because we're being told to vote that way. It's like, what are we gonna do? We're gonna go all in and like, you know, fight some endless race war, you know, in on the Cape. I mean but South Africa had been at war literally for 20 years. They've been fighting the Cuban fucking army. Okay, I mean, it's like it's at some point like war weariness sets in. They were a state that was totally mobilized. You know, like even like every man served in the SADF, and then he was, you know, on active reserve status for decades after. You know, I mean, it's like something had to give. You know, and it's So I mean, that's what that's basically what happened. But and like I said, that footage of those guys being executed in the street, like literally, that's like been very quickly memory hold. I'm sure you could find it now, but it's like that story ran. You know, there was, you know, like 93, 94, like the nightly news was, you know, they were relaying like at any moment, you know, South Africa is going to devolve into race war. But then very quickly, you know, that was a memory hole. It was just like never talked about again. I mean, to your point, because the narrative's like, oh, this is the end of history, and like now there's just no more quote racism in South Africa. But very, very disastrous situation, you know. And obviously later on too, Boers have been availed to a tremendous amount of violence. You know, everybody knows about the farm killings and stuff. I don't want to go down like a list of atrocities or something. Okay, I not because I'm like afraid to talk about upsetting things or because I want to like hide that stuff, obviously, but people can see that on their own, and it's frankly it's depressing to delve into. But everybody who thinks critically or knows the history like knows the reality of these things. But that's basically what happened, and what was keeping South Africa alive what was the Cold War. Okay, I mean that's what it was. The degree to which on November 9th, 1989, everything changed. They can't be overstated. Okay, it I can't emphasize that enough to people. Like it changed everything. You know, it's you know, not just in terms of relations between states and power political affairs between, you know, states and between allied blocks, and but I mean the internal situation of states, including the United States, like changed totally. I mean so there's it's all of those things. But you know, I'll get back to you in a minute because I realize I've been speaking for a long time. But if we've got a big tent in our faction, and you know, in our kind of resistance community, and that's great. Okay. However, if you're like us, when I say us, like you and myself, you know, people. There's a reason I emphasize, you know, Prods and Ulster as well as, you know, uh, the the Boer, the white tribe in South Africa, because like I said, the American experience is peculiar, in ways that are both good and bad, but it's paralleled in places like Northern Ireland and to an even greater degree in South Africa. So, not only should we sympathize with these people and hold them in our hearts and in our thoughts and prayers, but there's also things we can extrapolate from the situations, respectively. So that's why South Africa is important. And that plus, two Afrikaners generally are unapologetic people. They're proud of who they are, and they don't they don't care. They don't care if losers want to put shade on them, because like why would they? You know what I mean? That's I want people to adopt that attitude. People gotta get over this like social pressure, like this what will the neighbors think bullshit. Okay, like I'm not saying everybody needs to live their life like me or something, but you people have to stop. You have to stop like apologizing for being right wing, or like thinking there's something like weird or wrong with it. It's like the people who hate you are the weirdos and the deviants. What I mean? Like that's so that Afrikaners, they're admirable in a lot of ways. And that's kind of why I guess I emphasize them and their situation a lot more than some people might think is.
Well,
Go ahead, yeah.
I definitely share your admiration, and actually, I will link this because this is one of the. And I'm sure this may be different generation to generation, but for me, there are kind of things on the internet that I can remember changing my life. Like some people are like, oh, I remember where I was when Kennedy was shot or something like that. And that's kind of a universal experience to one degree or another. But to me, I remember, and this is Conscious Caracal. I'll link the episode I'm talking about. I can't remember off the top of my head. But he was talking with another guy in AfriForum. And they're basically saying like, okay, why don't you leave? Because as a Boer, not only are you legally discriminated against, not just are people are rude to you, but it is materially harder for you to get into college, to get a job, to own a business for a variety of reasons, that someone who's more educated can explain to you. And not to mention that, but there is a active campaign to murder Boers, right? Especially literally farmers, right? Which is what Boer means, but essentially white South African farmers are being killed. Now, do I mean that it's like a full on, like Soviet style genocide? No, but there is ethnic cleansing going on.
Yeah, definitely.
And what he basically said is he's like, look, like, what do you get if you run away? Like, really, like, what do you get? You go to somewhere else that's maybe a little bit better. But whatever the thing, the entropy, the evil force in the world that is making your home worse, it is going to find you there. And so what he basically said is, and he used an analogy from the Boer War, right? Which is, okay, well, why do you dig a trench? When you dig a trench, and sometimes you have to fall back to dig a trench, but you dig a trench, you have somewhere to fight. And he basically said, look, like this place is my home. My ancestors have been here for, essentially as long as the U.S. has been settled, right? And he's like, look, like I'm not going to throw that away for my own personal comfort, because the things that I like about the place that I live, the thing that make it worth defending, are there because someone essentially put in the blood, sweat, and tears to put it there. And so he basically said, he's like, look, like I'm not going to give up my home. And to me, this was particularly impactful because I was kind of in a situation where I had just moved away from my small town to a bigger city to essentially make more money. I was kind of looking around, I was like, well, what the hell am I doing? Like really, like if I have these beliefs, if I have whatever you want to call them, right wing or normal, as I have kind of, prefer to call them, like that kind of requires a certain amount of personal sacrifice. And to me, I've always admired the Afrikaners for that, because they are not living an easy life.
No.
They could very easily move to the Netherlands, a
Well,
much
it's
more
also
sympathetic culture.
Yeah, it's also something I want to point out, and I mean, I insinuate this in my fiction a lot because that seems to be a better platform for it because it is somewhat abstract. But in addition to the ethical issue, like yeah, you don't just like up and run away from your home. Like one of the points I always make to people, one of the reasons America has problems, this idea that if there's a war or a depression, you just up and run away to America from your home. Like people who just drop everything and turn their back on their family, their culture, their language, their heritage, those are weird people. And often they've got something really wrong with them. Okay. So, I mean, this idea that, like, oh, there's a war in Syria, everybody should empty out of the country and move to America as, refugees or as people who need asylum. like, yeah, that's a coward's move and a fool's errand, and it means you don't actually stand for anything, you don't care about what counts. But also, maybe it's because maybe you have to be older to recognize this, or maybe it's just, you know, like Heidegger pointed out, when he dealt with consciousness, and this is becoming more and more to the fore as having, a scientific basis, epigenetic memory and things. Like, you really are kind of the progeny of generations before. Okay, and there's this kind of shared consciousness that, it's not heritable like your eye color, your hair color, but it is heritable. Okay, so I mean, that's what endures after you die. Okay, that's what's perennial. That's what it is to live historically. Just saying, like, yeah, I'm just gonna like cut off my culture and, alienate myself from history and just become, this kind of anonymous person in this geography of nowhere. Like, it's kind of a way of like committing homicide against yourself metaphysically. Okay, I mean, like, it's and against like your entire lineage. I mean, if it was just you, it would be a suicide. But
No,
there's something wrong with people who think that way. And also, even just more pragmatically, just let me get in this point. I'll turn it over to you. People tell me that, like, because they seem to be like Chicago is like some hellhole. It's like, well, I'm from here, man, and like, to your point, like, what am I gonna do? I'm just gonna like run to some random town where like I don't know anybody, I don't fit in with people, I'm not really familiar with the customs. Like why would I do that? Like, why would that be better? So I can be some like weird old guy who's like, yeah, there's no, there's no stupid immigrants around and no black people. It's like, okay, that's dope, but like, so I can like sit in my house and be happy that there's not like, like these problem populations around or whatever. Like, that's like an autistic way, figuratively and literally, of like looking at life and the circumstances we find ourselves in. But yeah, go ahead.
well, and to me, look, I'm no Catholic, but I think that you don't have to be to kind of recognize the genius in Dante. And his circle for usurers and sodomites, people who essentially produce money, out of money for its own sake, and people who essentially, have sex for sex's sake, in the Catholic understanding. But what he basically describes them as doing is kind of like endlessly tilling a desert, right? Like doing the work without reaping anything. And to me, there's this kind of analogy between that and this like weird, listless cosmopolitan, kind of, I'll go to anywhere as long as they have a Starbucks, right? Which is like, these people are just so odd and disconnected from kind of like the things that make you human. And part of that is like a place in a community, and you can't just move that and have it be the same. It is tied to a place. And to me, it all goes back to this big distinction. There's a, some British conservative wrote a typically tepid article about this, right? But he essentially broke it down to like, well, are you a somewhere or an anywhere type of person? And that's a fundamental difference. And to me, these people are like, and I'm sure you may have met these people, but there's like a growing tide of, millennials and Gen Z who are, actively anti-natalist. The idea that like, oh, my bloodline dies with me. And to me, it's this weird, odd, like radically selfish way of living, where the ultimate goal of your life is essentially to like increase your like utils of pleasure. And the idea that you could be called to give anything of yourself, to a people, to a place, to even your own lineage, it's just incomprehensible. And I
Well,
think it speaks to,
yeah, it's also weirdly self-defeating. Like, it's kind of like, in addition to it being like kind of, it's like sociopathic in the way that dullards often are. But I mean, even if you're basically a shitty person, it's like an own goal. Like, it's like, okay, so you're just gonna remove yourself from history. It's like, that means you like don't matter. What I mean? It's like, that means like you have no
right.
stake in
Yes.
anything, and it means you're basically like you're kind of like a punk. It's like you're one of the expendables. You're one of the nobodies, because it's like, other lineages are going to exist perennially, and yeah, pretty much everybody. Well, I think this, I don't want to go too far afield, but I think that's what someone understood, like the COVID nonsense. Like, people have some idea in this country like they're not going to die. Like, they really do. Like, subconsciously, they can't come to terms with dying, so they just like pretend it's never going to happen. So it's like, so I think some of these people are like, they figure like they can't accept it, so that they can't envision a future without them. So it doesn't register that, like, well, I'm not going to be here very long, and I'm a part of something that's perennial, and I've got to make sure that that's in place before I go. There's like, oh, I'm never going to die, so why would I want kids? They cost money, and then I can't go out and do fun things. Like, it doesn't compute that like they're gonna die soon because nobody lives very long. You know,
Right.
like 80 or 90 years actually is not a long time. There's freaking parrots that live longer than that on average. You know, like humans. That's what I'm not a big fan of Tolkien. I'm like a Frank Herbert guy. But you know, in Tolkien's books, like the races, you know, like the elves and like the dwarves and stuff, like all these races live for like thousands of years, but man, like, is this incredibly short-lived being. Like, that's actually true. Like, for it's weird how humans basically are like, you know, they've got everything on the animal kingdom in every sense, but as a species, like, people are only here for like the blink of an eye. You know, so it's you're in some basic way you're like unable to live life as an adult man or an adult lady if your notion is I never want kids. It's like, well, okay, man, but before you know it, you're gonna be an old person and you're gonna die. You're not gonna stay some like perpetual adolescent forever. You know, like it, you know, and it's like they can't handle that. You know, so it's you know, I really believe that, and that's why I like when the government claims the seasonal flu is like a global emergency. Like, people like freak out because on some level it forces them to confront reality that, like, well, yeah, you could die at any time. You know, it's I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. But it's also too like, yeah, but it's also too there is an upshot to that. I mean, I realize people think I'm an elitist and kind of like a mean person, but these freaks you talk about, you know, they're like ugly people inside and out. And I don't sit around hating people or want bad things to happen to people, but if these people want to remove themselves from history, I've got no problem with that. I don't want these people around in 500 years. You know what I mean? So it's like, go ahead. You know, I mean, it's unfortunate that they're able to poison the cultural well the way they are, but it's, you know, they're not our people, man. They're really really damaged people, and we don't want them. We don't need them. So look at it like that.
Right. To me, it reminds me of, and I've only read the intro to the book, but it's On Killing by, I think it's David Grossman.
David Grossman, that guy's a big fraud. But yeah, go ahead.
So fair enough, right? And I haven't actually read the book because I wasn't really interested in the book. But his intro to it is he makes a compelling argument, and what he basically says is, look, like, people have become radically, like, I guess, like, detached from birth and death. So he's basically saying, like, look, like, if you can imagine kind of an average human over the last however long of human history, it's difficult to say, but he's like, look, like, that existence was one in which you came into contact with birth and death on a fairly regular basis, right? You had animals, you had a multi-generational family. And so, you know what, like, obviously you didn't just live as kind of a nuclear family with mom and dad, and your grandparents, if they die in a home somewhere, right? Well, your grandparents, if they died in your house. You probably had siblings who died. And so death was a prescient reality in your life. You know, it wasn't something to be kind of like pushed to the side. And it's interesting because you're right, he may be a fraud, but I have a one of my best friend, his family, in addition to owning a cattle ranch, also runs, a small town funeral home.
Oh wow.
And what they talk about, because it's multi-generational, right? And they've
Yeah,
got
funeral homes always are. Yeah.
yeah, and he's got his grandfather who has, been running it since the 50s, who's now, 85. And he's talking about the difference of how people react to death. Like, no one wants an open casket. No one wants to see a dead body. Everyone just wants wants grandma cremated, stuck in an urn. And he's like, look, like, it's kind of killing the business of funeral homes because people are so radically, like, deracinated. They can't even be bothered to essentially show up to their dad's funeral, because that's not only an imposition, but that requires you to kind of acknowledge mortality.
Yeah. No. Exactly. What's also that's part of why I'll go even Grossman's a jagoff, but he was right about that. But I'll also point out, women used to die constantly in childbirth, and bring because it's really I mean, if you think about it, I don't want to upset people or be crass about it, but it's really incredible. Like a woman giving birth to a baby naturally, that like tears her body apart. And tradition, if you don't have modern medicine and things, it's like sure her odds are probably like 50-50. So I mean, it's like you become a woman, like you basically grow up and you come to terms with the fact you're going to die. And if you're a man, that usually comes from the hunt, or it comes from going to war, or it comes from some kind of rite of passage. Like, nature makes you a woman because that's when you are able to get pregnant. But it's like, so every lady who survived, when she got pregnant as a teenage girl, She was very aware, like, when this child comes out of me, it might tear me apart and kill me. I'll just bleed out. You know, so if you live through it, it's like that's part of how you become an adult. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that underlies marriage, obviously because marriage is can't be extricated from the procreative function. That's kind of when you become an adult. When you come to view yourself as a parent, and also come to terms with, to your point, like life and death. It's one of the reasons why I like the gay subculture. I mean, there's a lot there that it's that is psychosocial. It's not simply about sexuality, and part of it is it's about like never becoming an adult. It's about like never looking at women as anything other than your mommy, and never looking at them as romantic partners. It's about never like acting like a grown man. It's about like never accepting that you're going to get old. I mean, that's all these things are bound up together.
Well, and I
I
think you
mean,
see that in essentially like a lot of like Tinder, right? And a lot of heterosexual dating apps essentially not stole their, because it was deliberately, it was in the same company in many cases, basically stole their model from the gay community, right? That's like hypergamy, like kind of like wheeling and dealing through sexual interactions. And it is profoundly, it is adolescent in the idea that like if you're talking about like you kind of become a man, you become a woman, through this kind of like dangerous act, first, being married, and then, later childbirth, right? It was immensely physically risky, right? Like you ascend kind of like through, the stages of life by essentially adopting more and more kind of ties to your community and to others,
well,
right?
yeah, and think about it like this too, and it's good. It's important. It's good you raised that point. I mean, I'm a lot older than you, so it might not impact you as much. But when I hear people my age, like people in their 40s, 50s, talk about quote dating, I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you going to the senior prom? It's like if I wanted a wife, I'd start like looking around for a lady a little bit younger than me, because I'm an old guy. I'd be looking for a lady who was like 30, 35, who could still get pregnant. But if I've got no business hanging around girls or women rather. I mean, unless I'm looking for a wife. Like what? We're gonna go on a date to the movies. Like what? We're gonna go to the senior prom. Like I don't. Like, you don't talk about quote unquote dating when you're 46 years old. Like if you're going, if you want to get married, that's great. That's what you should do. But then you're looking for a wife. Like
Right.
you're not quote unquote dating like that. That's what you do when you're 17 years old. When you
Right.
like,
Yeah. You get to take
yeah,
dad's car out for the weekend.
yeah, and
Yeah.
you got to
Something
get
like
used.
that.
Yeah, it's like how you learn how to talk to girls and not be a goof, and like and some girls like learn to like not be freaked out by men. Like yeah, okay, it's like you're not. Yeah. It's not just. I'm not just being some jig off like English language snob like that. That actually is really really perverse to hear people talk that way. Like it. And yeah, well, it's also too like that's why the government pushes homosexuality so much. I mean, part of it's because they're constantly looking for like metaphorical solvents, to kind of break the bonds that are organically occurring between people socially for the purpose of engineering their behavior and eradicating cultural modalities that people view as authoritative. But it's also that's considered like the ideal. Like men and women only get together because it's like some kind of like sex consumer choice. There's nothing to do with families, nothing to do with pregnancy. Like I remember telling a guy, I actually like your generation. I don't bash like Zoomers and millennials, but this one guy, he's not like in our, he's not in our, he's not in our circles. He's just like a dude I know, and he was he was freaked out about like a pregnancy scare, and I told him like, look, man, I'm like, if you've got no business, I told him basically, in terms, you've got no business having sex with a girl if you're worried about getting her pregnant. That's what happens when you have sex with women. And he like acted like I was saying crazy things. Like he was silent, but I could tell by the look in his face that like he's thinking, wow, this old guy is like some nutcase or some like holy roller. It's like it's like so it's like nuts to you that like you shouldn't have sex with girls that you aren't okay with getting pregnant. It's like, well, what do you think sex is, man? I mean, like, why do you think it exists?
Well,
It's
and it's so odd to me because going back to kind of what we were talking about, how like so many people, specifically South Africa, but also in this case, kind of don't really think of things. They just kind of like absorb, broader cultural ideas. I really do feel bad for people, and I'm sure you've seen people like this who essentially kind of think that their early 20s are going to go on forever. And, I think this is especially apparent with women, but I think we're deluding ourselves if this doesn't happen to men too.
Oh, definitely.
Who essentially just, you know, live hard, have a 3-digit body count, and then are wondering why they can't settle down and be normal at 38. And you're like, well, did you think this was all a game? Right? Like, your life is your life. And the idea that, like, oh, you can just waste 10 years doing, essentially nothing and have that be, a choice you are kind of untouched by is very odd to me. And look, I get it. I'm 23. 10 years is a whole lot of my life proportionally, but still, like, there's this weird idea that you can essentially, not you personally, but, like the cultural you can kind of just like do whatever you want and grow up later and just keep pushing that back.
No, it's totally nuts. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It does impact men. It impacts men in different ways, but they're just as bad as females. Like, you're gonna have a bashing females. I mean, anything but a white knight. If anything, like, it's weird. People in my generational code rate tell me I'm like some kind of savage for the way I talk to and about women. But then, like, these internet guys are like, you're a white knight. It's like, no, I'm just saying, like, women aren't any better or any worse than men. And if you got an accident with women, you're being a loser. They're just different. And, like, men are just as bad with immaturity, just in a different way, because men and women are different. But yeah, I'm also in the mind, I guess, I made this point again and again, and I'm not just talking shit. I'm really serious. Like, the worst time of my life was as a teenager and a guy in his early 20s. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was scared all the time. Like, everything was like a mess. Like, being a guy in his 40s is pretty dope, assuming, like, you've got your health and, like, you're not sitting in prison or something. Like, you like things just become easier, and, like, people, like, respect you more, and there's just, like, more and more options, and you actually have, like, equity in things, like, figuratively and literally. So you're not always worried about money and stuff. I mean, it's like I wouldn't go back to being 19 years old for $1 billion. Okay, so when I hear guys my age, saying, like, man, like, I can't even, I don't even like thinking about high school because nothing could ever touch that. It's like, bro, when you were like 17 and like getting demerits from hall monitors, that was like the best time in your life. Really, man? It's like, what kind of horrible life did you have after that? I mean, and it's, I can't, I can't even fathom that, but it's, like I said, I believe firmly, it's back to what you were saying, what I raised about people being unwilling to accept mortality. Like, I really believe that. Or maybe I'm an outlier. Maybe most people have like this awesome time as a teenager. I didn't. Nobody I knew did. I mean, I don't know. Okay, but
No, I'm with you on that. Like, look, like it's an important part of life in the sense that you can't really jump from being a child to a full grown adult. Like, it's necessary, but
oh yeah, and some good things happen. It's not like it was hell.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of what I look back on it, and I think this is necessary, is just kind of a mix of like profound embarrassment, especially if you're interested in anything like mildly like political or philosophical.
Yeah.
And you look back and you're like, what? It's like, I think for a lot of guys in these side of things, that's when you kind of hit the first cul-de-sac for young right-wing guys, which is like wait, I'm a Republican, but slightly more libertarian.
Yeah.
So I won't even touch social issues, so you can't call me racist.
Right. Right.
And so, like, I look back at that, I'm like, God, dear God, like, ugh. And so, but my point is that not that like, oh wow, let's all laugh at me for being an embarrassing 17-year-old, but look, like, that's a stage in your life, and the idea that like you peak at 17 is just, it's a little bit embarrassing. It almost tells you more about the person saying it than it does anything else.
Well, yeah, and it's like yeah, man, and it's like, I mean, I can see it if you're a limited guy, and I mean, I'm not saying that to be mean, but let's say there's some guys who are limited and like they're like great athletes, but they're not great enough to like make the NFL, okay? And it's like, if you're a limited guy and you got like a great throwing arm, but other than that, there's not a lot going for you, and so like you're like the king of some like freaking highly competitive like high school where they got a great football program, and then like after that, you literally work some shit job, and it's like I can understand a guy like that like looking into his cocktail and saying like, man, like what went wrong? Like when I see guys like who are of like above average intelligence, and have objectively like good jobs, and they got like wives and kids, it's like, bro, like what are you talking about? You know what I mean? It's really it's almost kind of like low key sociopathic. Like I can't find value in anything other than when I get my rocks off all the time and be like act like live like a degenerate but chalk it up to youthful indiscretion. It's really disturbing. And I mean, like I said, Maybe I was just like I don't think I was any cooler or bigger or like any cooler or uncool than like anybody else. But like I said, man, like I don't look back on my youth as like, oh, that was hell. But it's like, man, like it was probably about the most like unfun, like uncool, like part of my life, man. And like, that's why I'm always saying like, that's why I don't bash young people. It's not just because that's fake and fucking like GHEY. It's because like being a young person actually is not easy, and being my age is a lot easier. I mean, granted, I'm like a single man. It's not like I'm looking after a bunch of kids. It's not like I got a wife who has got problems I got to attend to. But being like 17 to 25 years old is not easy, man. And I'm the first to admit I've got it easier than a lot of people. Okay, and I definitely have it easier than young guys today. I don't lose sight of that. But I gotta wrap this up shortly because I'm gonna have to run out to a meeting soon, and I'm gonna have to like make myself presentable and like change up. Obviously, like I'm not wearing appropriate attire to like meet the public, but we can well, like this hour went by fast, but we can other than any day other than Saturday, we can record again if you want to this week.
Yeah, sure thing, man. I will get back to you. Your links will be down in the description. I trust Steel Storm 2. That's going to be out sooner or later, right?
Yeah, it's going to drop in the fall. And I've been posting excerpts from it and from some other Steel Storm content on my Substack, and it for absolutely free. So yeah, and I'm bearing down on my science fiction brand, and I'm bearing down on the Nuremberg book. That probably will not drop realistically until like February. But I'm busying myself and being diligent with this stuff. So yeah, it is coming, and yeah, I really appreciate you hosting me, man. And I'm sorry. I'll have to host you on the Mind Phaser pod, and then we can go as long as we want. And I'll set a dedicated block of time. So if we want to talk for 3 hours, we can do that. But
well, sure thing, man.
But yeah,
I always enjoy our conversations.
No, likewise.
They always go productive directions. So anyway, guys, my links are down in the description. If you want to join the Telegram, we'll have that separate. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. We've seen a lot of growth, and it's been a lot of fun. This episode should go up, Thomas, Tuesday. Anyway, you guys will hear that live. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night, everyone.